The wind, a ghost of winter, rattled the bare branches around Arthur Vance's remote cabin. Dusk bled across the vast, darkening landscape, painting the sky in bruised purples and greys. On his weathered porch, an unwelcome guest held vigil. A large, scarred dog, its fur a matted tapestry of browns and greys, sat stoically, a silent monolith of unwelcome devotion. Arthur Vance, a man whose rigid posture screamed a lifetime of self-imposed isolation, watched from behind the cold glass of his living room window. He hated dogs. He had always hated them, with a visceral, unyielding certainty forged in a childhood trauma. Yet this creature, a stray seemingly carved from the very rock of the mountains, refused to leave. Its amber eyes, intelligent and unblinking, were fixed on his front door, a silent challenge to Arthur's entire existence. The man's breath plumed against the glass, a stark contrast to the animal's unnerving stillness. He watched, fists clenched, as a shiver ran through the dog's lean frame. But it did not stir, did not whimper. It simply lowered its head onto its paws, a picture of impossible patience. What happens when a lifetime of hatred is met with a devotion it never asked for and cannot understand? Arthur's life was a fortress, meticulously constructed over decades. Every object in his Spartan home had its place, every routine its immutable time. The worn leather armchair faced the unlit fireplace, never the window. His books, bound in sensible, dark covers, stood in precise military rows. Even the faint scent of pine and old paper was a deliberate choice, warding off the cloying sweetness of sentiment. Mornings began with the whistle of a kettle, the grind of coffee beans, and a solitary walk along the perimeter of his property, surveying the boundaries of his solitude. He noted every fallen branch, every shift in the creek bed, every sign of nature's ceaseless, indifferent change. There were no unexpected visitors, no stray conversations to navigate. His world was a perfectly calibrated machine, designed to keep both the chaos of human connection and the specter of his own buried memories at a safe distance. But the dog had jammed a wrench into the gears. This was day 3 of the unwelcome vigil. 3 days since the mangy beast had materialized from the deepening autumn woods, limping onto his porch and settled in as if it owned the place. Arthur's internal monologue was a simmering stew of frustrated rage and deeply ingrained fear. He saw the dog not as an individual creature, but as the embodiment of every snapping jaw, every unexpected lunge, every betrayal of trust. A fragmented image flashed unbidden, a blur of teeth, the sudden searing pain on his forearm, the overwhelming smell of something wild and dangerous, a child's scream swallowed by fear. His scar, a raised white ridge on his left forearm, throbbed with the ghostly echo of that long-ago moment. Every dog, in Arthur's eyes, was merely a monster in waiting, a ticking time bomb of unpredictable violence. He had tried everything. On the first day, he'd shouted, his voice rough from disuse, the words echoing strangely in the vast quiet. The dog had merely lifted its head, its amber eyes meeting his without aggression, only a profound, unsettling stillness. The second day, Arthur had clapped 2 thick planks of firewood together, the sharp crack cutting through the silence. The dog flinched, its ears flattening momentarily, but it did not flee. It simply repositioned its head, its gaze unbroken. He'd even hurled a small rock near it, carefully missing just enough to startle. The dog had merely watched the stones skip across the porch, then settled back down, seemingly unfazed. Its persistence was unnatural, almost supernatural in its unwavering focus. It was less an animal and more an idea, an immovable object placed squarely in the path of Arthur's unyielding will. He poured himself another cup of coffee, the lukewarm liquid doing little to thaw the ice in his veins. He looked out the window again, across the darkening yard, past the frost-tipped trees, to the stoic figure on his porch. Arthur Vance, in his meticulously ordered home, was a prisoner in his own domain, consumed by a frustrated rage that was slowly being eroded by a creeping, unwelcome curiosity. Arthur Vance, in his meticulously ordered home, was a prisoner in his own domain, consumed by a frustrated rage that was slowly being eroded by a creeping, unwelcome curiosity. Days bled into one another, marked by the steadfast presence on his porch. A full week passed. The dog remained, an unyielding sentinel against the backdrop of changing light. Arthur watched it from various windows, often finding himself pausing mid-chore, a towel in hand, a book half read, drawn by its sheer, unnerving stillness. It moved only to shift its weight, to stand and stretch, or to lap at the puddles that formed after the morning dew, its ribs now more defined beneath its matted coat, a testament to its hunger. His annoyance, a thick, familiar cloak, began to fray at the edges, replaced by a grudging, almost irritated respect for the creature's impossible stubbornness. He'd seen plenty of wildlife in his decades as a ranger. Resilience was common, but this unwavering, almost personal vigil felt different. It was an affront to his logic, an uninvited challenge to his perfectly constructed solitude. One afternoon, the silence of the house grew too heavy, too accusatory. Arthur found himself staring at the rotary phone on the kitchen wall, a relic he rarely used. He picked it up, his fingers hesitant on the dial. The decision felt like a monumental breach of his own unspoken rules, a direct engagement he'd sworn against. He called animal control. The woman on the other end, her voice weary and distant, explained their limited resources, the backlog of calls for strays in such a remote district. "A non-aggressive dog, sir. No immediate threat. We're short-staffed. Might be another week, maybe more." Arthur gripped the receiver tighter. "And you're certain it isn't causing any trouble?" she asked, a hint of suspicion in her tone. "No, no trouble," Arthur grumbled, then almost defensively, "and I'm not feeding it, if that's what you're implying." He hung up, the click echoing in the quiet room, feeling a knot of something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. The bureaucracy, as cold and indifferent as he'd expected, offered no quick solution, only extended the stalemate. The sky, which had been a dull, bruised grey for hours, finally broke. A cold, insistent drizzle began, tapping against the window panes, then escalating into a driving autumn rain. The wind, a mournful whisper at first, quickly rose to a furious howl, tearing through the barren branches of the oaks, rattling the loose pane in the pantry window. The porch, previously merely damp, turned dark and slick, reflecting the churning clouds like a black mirror. Arthur watched the deluge from the comfort of his living room, a fire crackling in the hearth, a cup of tea warming his hands. But the warmth felt hollow. The external turmoil outside, the relentless assault of wind and water, mirrored a growing disquiet within him. He kept seeing the dog, hunkered down, its fur plastered to its body, shivering against the chill. He pictured its amber eyes, still fixed on his door, even through the sheeting rain. The image gnawed at him, a tiny, sharp tooth. He tried to read, to distract himself, but the words blurred. The dog's silent endurance, its inexplicable decision to weather this storm on his porch, felt like a judgment. He knew the temperature was plummeting. Hypothermia was a real threat for an animal already weakened by hunger. He got up, walked to the kitchen, then back to the living room. He couldn't shake the image. The fear he usually felt around dogs was slowly, imperceptibly, being eclipsed by something else. A prickle of responsibility, an urgent, unwelcome empathy. He glanced at the old tarp folded neatly in the mudroom, a relic from a long-ago camping trip. He looked at the empty dog bowl, still on the counter from when his sister had briefly considered getting a dog years ago, before he'd made his disapproval clear. This was it then. the ultimate capitulation, a profound act of self-betrayal. In the dead of night, the house silent save for the drumming rain, Arthur slipped his boots on, his movements slow and deliberate, as if trying to outrun his own decision. He unlatched the front door, just a crack, a sliver of light spilling into the storm. He pushed the old dry tarp out onto the far corner of the porch, then placed the bowl of fresh water beside it. The dog lifted its head, a silent, unblinking question in its eyes. Arthur didn't wait for a response. He slammed the door shut, the sound a thunderclap in the quiet night, before he could second-guess himself, before the tiny gesture could become a monumental failure in his own eyes. The image of the dog, curled tightly under the corner of the tarp, finally shielded from the worst of the rain. Arthur watches from the window, feeling not victory, but a strange, unsettling new emotion. The unsettling new emotion still clung to Arthur as dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in bruised purples and greys. He rose before the first light could truly break through the heavy clouds, drawn by an invisible thread to the window. The tarp lay crumpled in the corner of the porch, a dark, damp shape. Beneath it, a form. The dog. It hadn't left. Arthur felt a fresh wave of irritation, but it was thinner now, diluted by a strange, almost reluctant respect. The storm had done its worst, battering the old house with rain and wind, yet the creature had endured. It lifted its head as Arthur's shadow passed the window, amber eyes meeting his across the pane. A quiet acknowledgement that transcended words. The empty water bowl he'd put out glittered faintly. The truce, however fragile, held. A new ritual began, reluctantly, precisely. Each morning, Arthur would prepare 2 bowls, one of dried kibble, poured from a sack he'd bought with a scowl, and another of fresh, cool water. He would open the front door just enough to slide them onto the bottom porch step, carefully avoiding eye contact. He moved with a practiced brusqueness, his movements economical, designed to convey disinterest. The dog, now nameless in Arthur's mind but an undeniable presence in his life, would watch him from its spot by the door, unmoving. Only after Arthur had retreated inside, the door firmly clicked shut, would it stir. It would pad silently to the bowls, eat with a quiet dignity, and then return to its vigil. A respectful, almost formal, distance was maintained. The rhythm was a concession, a surrender Arthur refused to acknowledge even to himself, yet it governed his days. As he watched the dog eat one afternoon, the memory surfaced, unbidden, sharp as a sliver of glass. He saw a young Arthur, barely a teenager, perhaps 13 years old, lean and quick, exploring the overgrown creek bed behind a neighbor's sprawling yard. The air was thick with summer, buzzing with insects and the scent of damp earth. He remembered the thrill of discovery, the freedom. And then the neighbor's dog, a large German shepherd named Buster, usually boisterous but friendly, had appeared. Buster. The name still tasted like ash. One moment the dog was wagging its tail, panting playfully. The next, a snarl, a blur of teeth, a sudden, searing pain in his arm. No warning, no provocation. Just the shock of betrayal, the sickening understanding that something he had trusted, however innocently, had turned on him. The yelp of pain, the frantic scramble to get away. Buster's insistent, terrifying grip. The pain had faded, of course, stitched up by a nervous doctor, covered by bandages that felt too small for the depth of the wound. But the emotional scar, the indelible mark of absolute untrustworthiness, festered deeper than any physical gash. It was why he built walls. It was why every dog, every single one, was a monster in waiting, a potential betrayal. His fear wasn't just fear. It was a deeply ingrained conviction, a lesson learned in blood and terror. The memory receded, leaving the familiar phantom ache in his forearm. Arthur rubbed the faded scar, a pale, jagged line against his weathered skin. He found himself at the doorway again, peering out at the dog. "What do you want?" His voice was gruff, a gravelly whisper against the quiet hum of the house. "Honestly, what is it you're after?" The dog merely blinked, its head cocked slightly, as if listening intently to the wind. "Don't you have anywhere else to be?" Arthur continued, the questions aimed less at the animal and more at the vast, echoing silence of his own life. This was his first real communication with another living being in years, even if it was directed at an animal he claimed to despise, one he still saw, in fleeting moments, as a symbol of past pain. He looked at the scar on his arm, then at the dog peacefully resting on the porch. For the first time, he saw not a monster, but simply a creature, as alone as he is. The next morning, the ritual was the same. Arthur opened the door, a ceramic bowl of kibble and a fresh dish of water in his hands. He set them down on the porch steps, his gaze fixed on the quiet landscape, studiously avoiding the dog. He listened for the familiar rustle of movement, the gentle clinking of the bowl as the dog began to eat. But there was only silence. He risked a glance. The dog lay exactly where it had been when he retreated indoors last night, head still resting on its paws, amber eyes half-lidded. It did not stir. Arthur frowned, a prickle of unease unsettling the carefully constructed calm of his morning. He cleared his throat, a sharp, involuntary sound. The dog's ear twitched, but nothing more. Its breathing, he noticed, seemed shallow, barely perceptible against the crisp morning air. He waited, a minute stretching into 2, then 3. The dog remained unmoving, a statue carved from weary flesh. Arthur's annoyance, usually his first response, was now mixed with a nascent, unwelcome anxiety. He went back inside, the uneaten food a silent accusation on the steps. Throughout the day, the image of the dog's stillness gnawed at him. He watched from the window as he moved through his routines, making coffee, polishing his worn leather boots, tidying the few books on his shelf. The dog was always there, unmoving. The sun climbed, casting longer shadows across the porch. The air grew colder as dusk began to creep in. The dog still hadn't touched the food. A low whimper, barely audible, carried through the thick glass of the window, pulling Arthur from his reverie. He felt a sudden, sharp twist in his gut. This wasn't stubbornness or indifference. This was something else. He grabbed a powerful, heavy-duty flashlight from the coat rack by the door, its beam a stark, solid column in the fading light. His heart hammered a nervous rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat of fear and a strange, unfamiliar urgency. Stepping onto the porch, the cold air bit at his exposed skin. He moved slowly, deliberately, the beam of the flashlight dancing ahead of him, landing on the dog. Its eyes were open now, dull with pain, but it did not try to stand, nor did it shy away. As Arthur drew closer, the beam of light swept over its left hind leg, revealing the source of its suffering. A deep, ragged gash, dark and swollen, oozed faintly, its edges raw and angry. It was infected, no doubt about it. A fight with a coyote, perhaps, or a clumsy fall in the wilderness. It was a matter of life and death, stark and undeniable. Arthur's professional past, buried under years of self-imposed isolation, surged to the forefront. He was a ranger, trained to assess, to respond, to protect. He saw not a creature of fear, but an animal in distress, one that could not help itself. The image of the scar on his forearm, a phantom ache from a childhood long past, flashed in his mind. To touch this creature, this dog, was to confront that deepest, most visceral memory. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat, to lock the door and let nature take its course. But another, stronger impulse, born of the silent vigil and the quiet understanding they had forged, demanded action. His duty, once to the wild and unforgiving world, now extended to this lone, suffering animal on his porch. He turned abruptly, stepping back into the warmth of the house, the door clicking shut behind him. He didn't stop to second-guess himself. From the back of a rarely opened cupboard, he pulled out an old metal box, his emergency first aid kit, dusty but still stocked from his ranger days. Antiseptic, gauze, bandages, tape. He took a deep, steadying breath, then pushed open the door once more. The dog watched him, still unmoving. Arthur knelt, the cold of the porch seeping through his jeans. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice rougher than he intended, but surprisingly steady. "Just stay still." He moved slowly, his hand hovering, then gently pushing aside the matted fur around the wound. The dog trembled, a deep shiver running through its lean body, but it did not pull away. It seemed to understand. With meticulous care, Arthur cleaned the gash, the antiseptic stinging but sterilizing. He carefully wrapped the leg, securing the bandage, his fingers brushing against coarse fur, feeling the warmth of its skin beneath the matted hair. This physical contact, once unthinkable, was a point of no return, a profound, undeniable moment of healing for them both. Arthur sat on the porch steps, just a few feet from the resting dog, his hand still tingling from the feel of its fur. The physical barrier was broken. The tingling sensation in Arthur's hand lingered long after he retreated inside, a ghost of fur and shared vulnerability. Over the next few days, that feeling became a quiet anchor. His morning rituals expanded to include the dog, still resting mostly on the porch. Each dawn found Arthur carefully unwrapping the gash, cleaning it with a practiced hand that grew less hesitant with every passing day. The antiseptic stung, but the dog merely flinched, its amber eyes fixed on Arthur's face with a quiet patience, a deep understanding. He'd bring fresh water, then small portions of kibble, placing the bowl just within reach. There were no grand gestures, no overt attempts at affection, but in these quiet moments of dedicated care, a bond of trust, fragile yet undeniably present, began to solidify. The dog, though still wary, would lean ever so slightly into Arthur's touch as he rebandaged the leg, a silent acknowledgement of the healing hands. Arthur found himself speaking in low murmurs, not the gruff challenges of before, but gentle reassurances as he worked. "Almost done, fella," he'd say, his voice softer than he'd heard it in years. The wound slowly closed, a pink scar forming beneath the fur, a testament to the unexpected truce. Then winter arrived with the brutal swiftness of an unwelcome guest. The sky, which had hovered in shades of grey, deepened to an ominous lead. The first true freeze descended overnight, turning the world outside Arthur's window into a landscape of sharp, glittering ice. A dusting of fine, crystalline snow coated the ground, outlining the skeletal branches of the pines and frosting the edges of the porch. The wind, no longer a gentle sigh, howled through the gaps in the eaves, a mournful lament that carried the biting cold directly onto the porch. Arthur watched from inside, a knot tightening in his chest. The dog, now limping less but still recovering, was curled tightly on the tarp he'd provided weeks ago, its body shivering visibly despite its thick coat, its breath plumed in small white clouds. The porch, once a sanctuary of sorts, was now a brutal, untenable shelter. Survival demanded more. Arthur paced his Spartan living room, the wood floor creaking under his worn boots. He stopped at the front door, his hand hovering over the cold metal knob. Through the window, he could see the dog, its head tucked low, eyes half closed against the relentless wind. A lifetime of fear, of the visceral memory of teeth and pain, rose up like a solid wall. To let a dog, any dog, into his house, into the meticulously ordered fortress he had built around himself, felt like an act of profound self-betrayal. Yet, the image of its shivering form, the memory of its stoic patience, the knowledge of the wound he had tended, chipped away at the rigid certainty of his convictions. It was a silent debate, a war waged within the confines of his own skull. The wind outside roared, seemingly echoing the turmoil within. He took a deep, rattling breath, the decision finally made. He turned the knob, the sound sharp in the quiet house, and pulled the door open, letting the blast of icy air rush in. He looked at the recovering dog, shivering in the brutal cold, its amber eyes meeting his. He didn't speak immediately. He just stared, acknowledging the impossible choice he was about to make. Finally, his voice came, rough with emotion, raw with a vulnerability he hadn't felt in decades. "All right," he said, the words a strained whisper against the wind. "Come on." He stepped back, holding the door wide, a silent, monumental invitation. The dog hesitated, its gaze searching his face, as if seeking an assurance Arthur hadn't explicitly given. Then, with a slow, careful limp, it pushed itself up. Each step was deliberate, a victory over caution and pain, until it crossed the threshold, finally stepping into the warmth of the house. The dog didn't venture far, settling onto an old woven rug just inside the entryway, its body still tense, eyes scanning the unfamiliar space. It lay down with a quiet sigh, its shivering slowly subsiding. Arthur closed the door, shutting out the biting wind, the cold, the loneliness that had been his constant companion. He stood for a moment, simply watching the dog, this calm, beautiful animal that had bulldozed its way into his life, overturning every carefully constructed barrier. He no longer saw a stray, a creature of fear, a monster in waiting. He saw resilience. He saw quiet strength. He saw a companion. He dropped to one knee a few feet from the dog, and his voice, still rough, softened into something tender and new. "Bo," Arthur said quietly, tasting the name, finding it fit. "Your name is Bo." He watched as the dog's ears twitched, its tail giving a soft thud against the rug. Arthur closed the front door, with both of them now on the inside, shutting out the cold and the loneliness. A new chapter has begun. The cold, sharp silence of Arthur's home had been shattered, not by clamor, but by a new, comforting presence. Bo, his legs slowly mending, moved with a quiet dignity that belied his size. The entryway, his initial sanctuary, soon proved too small for the burgeoning warmth between them. As the first true blizzard swept down from the mountains, coating the world in a thick, insulating blanket, Bo found his rightful place. An old plush rug, once discarded in the attic, was resurrected and laid before the stone hearth, becoming his permanent domain. We see snow falling in thick, silent flakes against the dark window panes. Then a shot of Bo, curled like a question mark, bathed in the dancing firelight. Days bled into weeks, and the stark outlines of winter etched themselves across the landscape. But inside, a new season bloomed. Arthur's mornings, once a sterile procession of chores, now began with the soft, contented sigh of a large dog stretching by the fire, a gentle reminder that he was no longer alone. He watched as Bo, fully recovered, would nudge his hand with a wet nose, a silent invitation to the day. The deliberate pace of Arthur's life remained, but it was no longer solitary. His walks through the snow-laden woods, once meditations on emptiness, transformed into shared expeditions. Bo, always close, moved through the drifts with an effortless grace, his amber eyes scanning the tree line, a silent sentinel. Arthur found himself talking, a steady, low rumble of a voice unused to such constant company. He recounted tales from his ranger days, the changing patterns of the wildlife, the history of the mountains. He pointed out tracks in the snow, explained the purpose of each tree, shared the quiet wisdom of a lifetime spent observing nature. Bo, he swore, listened, his ears cocked, his tail giving a soft, rhythmic thud against the snow. When Arthur paused, there was no need for a leash. The unspoken agreement between them was stronger than any restraint. This silent understanding, this shared world, chipped away at the old man's carefully constructed isolation, brick by imperceptible brick. One frigid afternoon, a small, jarring intrusion occurred. Arthur and Beau were returning from their walk, the air biting and crisp, when they saw it. A delivery truck, its rear wheels spinning helplessly in a deep drift near the end of Arthur's long, unplowed driveway. Years ago, Arthur would have averted his gaze, perhaps even pretended not to see, retreating into his self-imposed solitude. But now, with Beau trotting calmly by his side, something stirred within him. "Looks like someone's in a spot of trouble, Beau," he murmured, a hint of concern in his voice. He grabbed his shovel from the shed, Beau waiting patiently at the door, and walked down to the truck. The young man behind the wheel, no older than his early 20s, looked up, relieved. "Oh, thank goodness! I thought I was stuck out here for hours." Together, they worked, Arthur's ranger strength still surprising him, Beau supervising from a respectful distance. When the truck finally lurched free, the young driver, a cheerful fellow named Ben, insisted on offering Arthur a fresh hot coffee from his thermos. Arthur, to his own astonishment, accepted. They stood by the steaming truck, the cold air prickling their cheeks, Beau sitting attentively at Arthur's feet. Ben scratched Beau behind the ears. "He's a great dog, mister. Real gentle giant." Arthur looked down at Beau, then back at the young man, a faint, unfamiliar smile touching his lips. "He is," Arthur agreed, his voice soft with a warmth that surprised them both. It was a fleeting, unremarkable exchange, but it was Arthur's first voluntary connection with another human being in years, a small crack in the dam, and Beau had been the bridge. Later, alone in the quiet of his home, Arthur caught his reflection in the hallway mirror. The harsh lines etched around his eyes, once monuments to stoicism, had softened. The perpetual tension in his jaw had eased. He found himself smiling, a genuine, unforced expression that felt foreign yet entirely natural. He looked away from his reflection, his gaze falling instead on Beau, stretched out contentedly by the dying embers of the fire. His fortress, he realized, had been less a shield and more a cage. And this gentle, persistent creature, the one he had tried so hard to drive away, had not just tunneled in. He had blown the walls wide open, letting in light, warmth, and the strange, unsettling, beautiful vulnerability of life. Arthur and Beau sat by the fire, a picture of perfect companionship. Arthur rested a hand on Beau's head, a gesture of effortless affection that would have been unthinkable just months before. The last wisp of winter had long since surrendered to the vibrant push of spring. Green shoots burst from the thawing earth, painting the once barren slopes in tender hues, and the harsh, unforgiving lines of the landscape softened under the nascent warmth. Arthur Vance's world, too, had shed its icy rigidity. Beau, fully healed, and a permanent, unquestioned fixture by the roaring fireplace, had brought a warmth and a quiet rhythm to Arthur's existence that he hadn't known since a forgotten childhood. Their mornings began with shared journeys through the crisp, revitalizing air, Beau trotting contentedly beside him, a silent, unwavering shadow. Evenings unfolded in companionable quiet, the dog's soft snores a gentle lullaby Arthur had never imagined needing, let alone cherishing. He often found himself reaching out, his hand finding the warm fur on Beau's head, the gesture now as natural as breathing, a silent testament to the walls that had not just crumbled, but had been lovingly dismantled. One Tuesday, as Arthur was clearing away the remnants of a simple breakfast, a distant rumble grew louder, cutting through the usual silence of the wilderness. He glanced out his kitchen window, his breath catching in his throat. A white pickup truck, emblazoned with the county's Animal Services logo, moved slowly up his long gravel driveway. Bo, who had been dozing by the back door, stirred, then let out a low, rumbling growl, a sound Arthur hadn't heard from him before, deep and protective. A man in a uniform, mid-40s, neat and professional, stepped out of the truck. Arthur felt a cold dread seep into his bones. He recognized the officer. Mark, the same Mark Jensen he'd called months ago, complaining about a non-aggressive stray. The memory felt impossibly distant, a phantom from a life Arthur barely recognized as his own. Arthur met Mark on the porch. The spring air, so recently mild, suddenly felt heavy and charged. "Mr. Vance," Mark said, his voice pleasant but with an underlying current of official authority. "Mark Jensen, Animal Services. Following up on an old report from last fall. Glad to see the dogs still here and looking well." Bo stood close to Arthur's leg, his amber eyes fixed on the uniformed man, a silent, watchful guardian. Arthur felt the tremor of Bo's body against his own. "He's not a stray anymore," Arthur replied, his voice rougher than he intended. "I recall the call." Mark nodded, a polite, almost sympathetic smile on his face. "Yes, well, that brings us to why I'm here. He looks like a fine animal, Mr. Vance, but I don't see any tags, any collar, or any proof of license or vaccination. Given his size and what looks like some German Shepherd or Mastiff in his lineage, he falls under certain county requirements." Arthur's jaw tightened. He's never left the property since winter, not once. Mark held up a hand. "Understood, but regulations are regulations. All dogs residing in the county must be registered, licensed, and vaccinated, or he'd have to be surrendered to the shelter." The word hung in the air, a cold, sharp blade. Surrendered. Arthur swallowed hard, a metallic taste filling his mouth. "What would that mean?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Mark's expression softened slightly, a flicker of genuine regret crossing his features. "I'm not going to sugarcoat it, Mr. Vance. Our shelter is always at capacity. An older, large dog, no known history, with some existing scars. He'd be a difficult placement, a low priority for adoption. We only have so much space, so much time." The unspoken implication was clear, a blunt, brutal fact that resonated like a death knell in Arthur's chest, a death sentence. "I can give you 30 days, Mark continued, pulling a form from his clipboard, "to get everything in order. Tags, license, vet records, proof of vaccination. Otherwise, per county code, I'd have to come back and take him." He handed Arthur the official notice, a sterile white sheet that felt like a warrant for Bo's life. The world outside, so recently vibrant with the promise of spring, seemed to dim, its colors leaching away. Losing Bo. The thought was a physical blow, sharper and more profound than any dog bite. His lifelong fear of dogs, the faded scar on his forearm, the decades of carefully constructed solitude, it all evaporated, leaving behind a searing, undeniable wave of fury. This wasn't about regulations or past trauma anymore. This was about family. This was about his, Bo. The fortress he had built around himself was gone. Now he had something infinitely precious to defend. Arthur stood on his porch, the official notice in his trembling hand, watching the Animal Services truck drive away. Bo came to his side and nudged his hand. Arthur looked down at him and said, "We're not done, not by a long shot." Arthur stood on his porch, the official notice in his trembling hand, watching the Animal Services truck drive away. Bo came to his side and nudged his hand. Arthur looked down at him and said, "We're not done, not by a long shot." The words were a promise, not just to the dog beside him, but to the transformed man within. His first act of defiance against the system, against his own ingrained fear, was to secure Bo's health. The next morning, a beat-up pickup truck belonging to Arthur Vance, a vehicle that hadn't seen the county road in years except for solitary supply runs, pulled into the gravel lot of a small veterinary clinic. Bo, looking around with calm curiosity, sat patiently in the passenger seat, his head occasionally turning to glance at Arthur. Inside, the sterile scent of antiseptic and unfamiliar noises made Arthur's jaw clench. He gripped the leash tight, not from fear of Bo, but from the visceral discomfort of being in such a public, vulnerable place. Dr. Evelyn Evans, a woman with kind eyes and capable hands, greeted them. Arthur, gruff but polite, explained their situation, the urgency in his voice betraying his usual stoicism. Dr. Evans listened with an empathetic nod as Bo, uncharacteristically, leaned into her offered hand, allowing her a gentle preliminary pat. It was clear to her, even then, that this was no ordinary stray. Bo underwent a thorough examination, received all his vaccinations, and was fitted with a microchip. Arthur watched the small procedure, his gaze fixed on the dog, a silent guardian. Dr. Evans remarked on Bo's remarkably gentle temperament, despite his scars and unknown past. "He's a good boy, Arthur," she said, sensing the unspoken bond. "A very good boy, and he's lucky to have you." Arthur merely grunted, but a warmth spread through his chest. He left the clinic with a lighter step, a bag of medication for an old skin irritation Bo had, and the first piece of documentation, Bo's official health record. The encounter had cost a significant chunk of his meager savings, but not once did he regret it. His next battle was against the labyrinthine county bureaucracy. Days blurred into a determined blur of phone calls and trips into town. Arthur found himself in the bustling, impersonal halls of the county services building, a place he usually avoided with the zeal of a hermit. He filled out endless forms, his precise handwriting stark against the official lines, detailing Bo's arrival, his recovery, his peaceful disposition. Each form felt like a tiny brick in a new wall, one built not to keep the world out, but to protect the vulnerable heart of his home. He paid the licensing fees, provided a sworn statement of Bo's history, carefully omitting the initial week of cold rejection, focusing instead on the emergent care. He even found himself chatting briefly with a harried clerk about the unexpected joys of pet ownership. Every step was a challenge, a forced departure from his solitary nature, but he met each with an unwavering patience born of fierce love. He wasn't just doing paperwork, he was building a case for Bo's life. The community, once a distant concept, began to materialize around him. Arthur, in an unprecedented move, called Ben, the delivery driver he'd helped out of the snowdrifts months ago. Ben, surprised but pleased to hear from Arthur, readily agreed to write a letter of support, recounting Bo's calm presence during the roadside rescue and Arthur's unexpected kindness. Dr. Evans's office also sent a glowing letter, attesting to Bo's excellent health and gentle nature, highlighting the profound bond she witnessed. These small acts of human connection, once alien to Arthur, were now vital lifelines, reinforcing his resolve. The isolation he had cultivated for decades was slowly being replaced by a small supportive community, each person a quiet ally in his fight. With the forms filed, the fees paid, the vaccinations documented, and the letters of support submitted, all that remained was the final hurdle: the home inspection by Mark, the animal control officer. Arthur had done everything by the book, meticulously preparing his home, Bo's newly purchased dog bed, the neatly arranged food and water bowls. He waited. The deadline loomed, a silent clock counting down. All he could do now was wait for the judgment. Mark's truck pulled back into the driveway for the inspection. Arthur and Bo waited on the porch, the place where it all began, ready to face the final judgment together. Mark's truck pulled into the driveway, its tires crunching softly on the gravel. a sound Arthur now recognized with a new kind of dread. Arthur stood on the porch, Bo a warm, solid presence at his hip, both of them still, a tableau of quiet defiance against the looming judgment. Mark, the animal control officer, emerged from his vehicle, his expression neutral, his movements efficient. He nodded a polite greeting, clipboard already in hand, and approached the porch, the same porch where this entire improbable journey had begun. His eyes, quick and experienced, took in Bo first, a brief assessment, then moved to the neatly arranged food and water bowls, the plush new dog bed tucked under the eaves. Arthur felt a tremor of anxiety, a raw, exposed vulnerability he hadn't known since childhood. Mark walked past them, stepping inside Arthur's home, a place that had been inviolable for decades. His gaze swept over the entryway, noting the sturdy leash hanging by the door, the small collection of dog toys neatly placed in a basket. He moved into the living room, his pace unhurried, his eyes missing nothing: the clean floors, the absence of clutter, the large worn rug by the fireplace where Bo's new orthopedic bed now lay, a clear impression of his body still visible on its surface. Bo, usually a shadow at Arthur's heels, remained surprisingly calm, watching Mark with a serene patience that spoke volumes of his trust in Arthur. Mark ran a hand along the sturdy fence Arthur had installed around the small backyard, checked the secure latch on the gate, then returned inside, his professionalism unwavering, his observations meticulous. He saw the world Arthur had built, not just for himself, but for this animal, a stark contrast to the barren, solitary existence he'd once maintained. They eventually settled at the small, round kitchen table, the silence stretching, punctuated only by the distant call of a hawk. Mark set his clipboard down, its papers crisp and official. He looked at Arthur, a softer, more reflective expression now on his face. "Mr. Vance," he began, his voice low, "I deal with a lot of neglect, a lot of abandonment, animals left to fend for themselves, or worse, people who don't care, or just don't understand the responsibility." He paused, pushing a stray hair from his brow. "What you've done here, in a few short months, it's beyond impressive. It's important." Arthur found himself holding his breath, a knot tightening in his chest. Mark continued, "This isn't just about paperwork, Mr. Vance. It's about a safe home, about care, about connection." He gestured vaguely around the tidy kitchen, the scent of fresh coffee still lingering in the air. "What you've done here, this is the reason I do this job." The unspoken words hung in the air, the reason he slogged through sad cases, the reason for the regulations, for the inspections. It was for moments like this, for animals like Bo finding a man like Arthur. A profound wave of relief washed over Arthur, so potent it threatened to buckle his knees. The weight he hadn't realized he carried, the constant low thrum of fear for Bo's future, dissolved in an instant. Mark picked up a pen, a soft click breaking the silence. He scrawled his signature, a definitive flourish, then stamped the final form with a satisfying thud. "Bo Vance," he stated, a small, genuine smile finally gracing his lips. "Officially, legally your dog." Arthur felt a hot prickle behind his eyes. He stood, extending a hand across the table, his grip firm, his gratitude immense. "Thank you, Mark," he managed, his voice thick with emotion, shaking the officer's hand, feeling the genuine warmth of it. "Thank you." Mark gathered his papers, offered a final nod to Bo, who had quietly laid his head on Arthur's foot, and left as quietly as he'd arrived, his truck pulling away, the gravel crunching a retreating melody. The house was suddenly silent again, but this time, it was a silence filled not with loneliness, but with a profound peace. Arthur sank to the floor, right there in the kitchen, Bo shifting to curl his body against him. He didn't speak. He couldn't. He simply wrapped his arms around the dog, burying his face in the soft fur, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent. The fur was warm against his cheek, the dog's soft rumble a vibration of pure contentment against his chest. It was over. The battle against his past, against the bureaucracy, against the very idea of love, was won. He had saved his friend, and in doing so, he had, finally, saved himself. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Arthur and Bo walked the familiar path into the woods behind the house. Bo, now a registered, beloved part of Arthur's life, trotted ahead, occasionally glancing back, a joyful bounce in his step. Arthur followed, a lightness in his stride he hadn't felt in decades. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, looking back at his small, weathered house. It stood silhouetted against the setting sun, no longer a fortress built to keep the world out, but a home warm and inviting, a sanctuary woven from trust and unexpected love. He had finally healed the wound from his childhood, not by forgetting it, but by overwriting it with a new, better story. Years unfolded like pages turned in a cherished book, each one filled with the quiet rhythm of two lives intertwined, flowing onward from that evening when Arthur had recognized his house as a home. The seasons turned, painting the mountains in hues of vibrant green, fiery gold, and then the stark, silent white of winter, only to begin anew. Arthur Vance, once a man of rigid routine, found his days now dictated by a different, softer tempo. His steps were a little slower, his back a touch more stooped, the lines around his eyes deepened, but they were lines etched by smiles as much as by years. Bo, too, wore the passage of time. His muzzle had silvered further, a distinguished crown of white against his dark fur, and he moved with a gentle, deliberate grace that spoke of age and contentedness. Yet, his amber eyes still held the same profound depth, the same unwavering loyalty that had first drawn Arthur in, that had been the constant, quiet center of their evolving world. Their bond was a tapestry woven from countless shared sunrises, silent walks through the whispering woods, an evening spent by the crackling fire, an unspoken understanding that transcended words. The final scene, a memory steeped in the golden light of a late summer evening, found Arthur where it had all begun, on his front porch. No longer a battleground or a boundary, the weathered planks had transformed into their sanctuary, a place of peace and shared presence. He sat in his old rocking chair, its gentle creak a familiar lullaby against the chirping crickets, the scent of pine and rich earth hanging heavy in the cooling air. Bo lay curled at his feet, his head resting peacefully on Arthur's knee, the soft rumble of his breathing a comforting anchor. Arthur's fingers, gnarled with age, absently stroked the familiar fur, feeling the warmth of Bo's solid body, a living testament to a life unexpectedly, gloriously altered. He looked out at the vast, darkening landscape, at the mountains that had watched his solitary life unfold, and a quiet, profound reflection settled over him. He had hated dogs his whole life, hadn't he? A lifetime of fear, of an old deep wound that convinced him they were fundamentally untrustworthy, incapable of the loyalty he craved and yet feared. He had seen them as monsters, as threats, as the embodiment of betrayal. But Bo, this quiet, scarred animal, had taught him that love wasn't about breeds or species, or even grand declarations. It was about choosing to stay. Bo had chosen a Porch, a man who pushed him away, a life of uncertainty, and Arthur, in turn, had chosen him back. It was that simple, yet so unbelievably profound. The wound on his forearm, a faint ridge beneath his skin, no longer brought a jolt of pain or a flash of old fear. It was just a mark, a memory, overshadowed by the living, breathing, loving presence at his knee. He had spent so long building a fortress against emotion, against connection, only to find it was a prison he'd unknowingly built around himself. Beau had simply sat at the gate, patiently waiting until Arthur found the courage to open it. Arthur's gaze drifted from the distant peaks to the dog, whose eyes were now closed in sleep, dreaming perhaps of rabbits or long sun-drenched walks. There was a sense of utter peace in Arthur, a profound gratitude for a life saved from bitterness, a heart cracked open to something beautiful and true. The transformation was permanent, etched into his very being. The love born of stubbornness and quiet vigil was forever. It was a quiet, perfect ending to a story that had truly just begun. The man and his dog together on the porch, watching the end of a perfect day, content in the world they